Hey there, welcome back to the quiet side of time. Tonight, we drift into a desert kingdom where truth weighed more than gold. Let your breath soften, your thoughts grow still, and your body rest. If calm stories help you sleep, stay close, something rare awaits. The air of Egypt was filled with silence at night, the desert stretching out in endless stillness. Stars glimmered above like grains of sand scattered across the dark sky, each one watching, each one waiting. In temples and in tombs, the people of the Nile whispered of what awaited them beyond death, not fire, not endless punishment, but a weighing. A single moment, a single judgment, where the heart of a person was measured against truth itself. They called it the Hall of Two Truths. It was not a hall of stone, though it was painted in their tombs and etched in papyri. It was a hall of eternity, where the gods gathered to receive the dead. At the center stood Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the underworld, who once had been a king upon the earth, murdered and revived, now seated in eternal judgment. Beside him were 42 divine judges, each a guardian of a law, each representing one aspect of Ma'at. Ma'at was more than justice. She was the order of the world itself, the rising and falling of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the balance between truth and lies. To live against Ma'at was to live against the rhythm of existence. And so, every Egyptian heart would one day be brought before her feather, white and pure, lighter than a whisper. The ritual was described in words that have survived on papyrus scrolls, in the painted walls of tombs, in fragments placed carefully beside the dead. The Book of the Dead, as we now call it, was not one book, but many. Spells, prayers, and instructions written in hieroglyphs told the soul how to walk through the perilous halls of the afterlife. There were gates guarded by serpents, rivers guarded by crocodiles, and caverns filled with spirits who tested the soul with riddles. But the greatest test was always the weighing of the heart. The heart, in Egyptian thought, was not just a vessel of blood. It was the seat of thought, of memory, of morality itself. Where others might look to the mind, the Egyptians turned to the heart. Every secret, every kindness, every lie, these were carried within its chambers. And when the body died, the heart was brought forward to stand before the scales. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, recorded the proceedings. His long beak bent as his stylus marked the verdict. Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of the dead, stood by the scales, ensuring their fairness, adjusting the beam with careful hands. Upon one pan was placed the heart. Upon the other, a single white feather, the feather of Ma'at. The silence of the hall must have been immense. One feather, one heart. If the heart was heavy with lies, with greed, with betrayal, the scales would tip against it. And there, waiting at the base of the scales, crouched Amit, the devourer. Her form was part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. She was not worshipped, not loved, but feared. For if she consumed the heart, the soul would be lost forever, dissolved into nothingness, never again to see the sunlight. But if the heart was lighter, if it balanced with the feather, the soul was allowed to pass into eternity. It would journey to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. There, the land mirrored Egypt's fertile Nile Valley, with tall stalks swaying, clear water shining, and endless abundance. A perfect reflection of earthly life, but without hunger, without pain, without end. In daily life, this belief shaped how Egyptians acted. Every interaction, every agreement, every oath was colored by the knowledge that their heart would someday be weighed. A lie told in darkness, a theft taken in secret, was never truly hidden. The heart remembered, and the scales could not be deceived. Even kings, even pharaohs were bound to this law. For though the pharaoh was divine, He too would stand before Osiris, his heart trembling upon the balance. It was said that before the weighing, the soul would make a declaration of innocence. This was not a simple denial. It was a series of 42 confessions called the negative confession. Each one addressed a god, each one rejecting a crime. I have not stolen, I have not slain, I have not spoken lies, I have not caused pain, I have not polluted the waters, I have not cursed the gods. One by one, the soul spoke these words, as though lifting burdens from its heart, placing them aside before the scales. In tombs, priests chanted these words on behalf of the dead, their voices echoing in cool stone chambers. They poured libations, burned incense, and traced hieroglyphs in fine black ink upon strips of papyrus. Some scrolls were buried with the wealthy, rolled beside their bodies, their magic meant to guide the heart safely through judgment. For those who could not afford such scrolls, simpler rituals and prayers were spoken, reminding the gods of the goodness within the heart. One lesser-known detail found in surviving papyri was a spell against betrayal by one's own heart, for it was believed that the heart might speak against its owner. If the heart remembered guilt, it might reveal the truth in the Hall of Two Truths. So spells were written, "O my heart, rise not against me as witness, stand not against me in judgment, speak not lies in the presence of the great God." Even the heart, it seemed, required persuasion. To stand in the Hall of Two Truths was to stand in perfect stillness. There was no rushing, no plea to overturn the balance. The gods watched, silent. The feather lay untouched, motionless, while the heart trembling with unseen weight. And in that moment, every action of life, every breath, every kindness, and every cruelty was revealed in the tilt of the scales. For the Egyptians, this was not a story of fear alone, but of hope. It meant that justice did not end with death. A poor farmer, cheated in life, could still find balance in the afterlife. A powerful man, cruel and dishonest, could still be brought low before the feather. Ma'at was not bribed, not swayed by wealth or power. She was eternal, her feather unchanged across centuries, light as truth, delicate as air. And so, life itself became a preparation for that weighing. The Egyptians built their tombs not only with stone, but with virtue. They carried themselves with careful words, mindful deeds, reverence for gods, fairness to others. Not always, of course, for crime and cruelty still existed, but always in the back of the mind, the feather waited, a reminder that the desert kept its silence and the scales would one day be filled. The tomb paintings, still surviving in fragments of ochre and lapis blue, showed the ceremony. The soul, small and human, brought before the towering gods. Anubis touching the scales, Thoth bending to write, Ammit crouched in hunger, Osiris seated in majesty, and beyond them, in the distance, a field of shining reeds swaying in windless air. The feather did not move, the scales did not tremble. All waited in silence. And here the chapter fades, with the image of a single feather resting weightless against eternity, trembling softly in the still air of the Hall of Two Truths, and waiting, still waiting.
The desert was quiet when the stars turned their faces toward the Nile. The river moved without hurry, carrying silt and song, its waters dark and patient. And upon its banks, the people of Egypt spoke softly of Ma'at, the balance, the breath, the truth that bound their lives together. Pharaohs did not rule by whim, not in the way of other kings. Their power was immense, but it was tethered to something greater, to Ma'at, the order of the world itself. Without Ma'at, the sun would fail to rise, the river would cease to flood, the desert would swallow the fertile land. Every royal act, every decree, Every judgment was spoken in her shadow. Pharaohs were not simply rulers, they were guardians. They held Ma'at in their hands, offered it to the gods in ritual, and reflected it to their people in justice. Paintings show them presenting a tiny figure of Ma'at, a goddess with outstretched wings and a single feather upon her head, handed reverently to the gods. It was more than a gesture. It was a promise. I, the king, preserve the balance of the world. Ma'at was not a code written on stone tablets, not a list of endless laws carved into monuments, not like the codified rules of Mesopotamia. She was simpler, quieter, broader. Her laws were spoken, remembered, lived. Do not steal, do not lie, do not harm another unjustly. Honor the gods, honor your family, keep the balance. The Egyptians believed that to break these laws was not only to wrong a person, but to weaken the very weave of the universe. A theft was not only a crime, it was disorder. A lie was not only a deception, it was chaos. And chaos was the shadow they feared most, the undoing of all that the Nile and the sun gave them. In decrees that survive on temple walls and papyrus, we hear pharaohs speaking not of conquest, but of order. Horemheb, a general who rose to kingship, once issued edicts to curb corruption. He punished officials who took bribes, who seized boats from poor farmers, who twisted truth for their gain. His words, carved in stone, carried not the voice of tyranny, but of restoration. He sought to return to Ma'at, to cleanse the courts, to balance the scales again. Other kings echoed the same language. They did not boast only of victories, but of keeping Ma'at alive in their reigns. On stelae and temple walls, they called themselves beloved of Ma'at, protectors of truth, shields against disorder. The gods too were thought to smile only upon those who ruled with balance. Even the mightiest pharaoh was subject to her unseen feather. The people too lived under this rhythm. When disputes arose over boundaries of fields, over trade, over inheritance, judges were called to restore Ma'at. The vizier, seated in solemn quiet, was said to embody her. One inscription instructs him, "Regard the man who is known to you like him who is unknown. Regard him who is near like him who is far." Equality, balance, fairness. These were not modern ideals, but ancient echoes, settling like dust upon the courts of limestone. The Nile itself seemed to teach this lesson. Its flooding was steady but never constant. Too much water and villages drowned. Too little and famine came. Balance was life. And so Ma'at was more than law. She was the river's rise and fall, the sun's path across the sky, the measure of grain, the weight of bread, the fairness of scales in the marketplace. Scribes recorded cases where false weights were punished, where deceit in trade was seen not just as fraud, but as an attack on order. Farmers who withheld grain, tax collectors who demanded too much, all were accused of breaking Ma'at. And though punishments varied, lashes, fines, even exile, the deeper wound was cosmic. Their actions tilted the scales of the universe. Even in daily speech, Ma'at lingered. It was said in greetings, in wishes, in prayers. To walk in Ma'at was to walk rightly, to be at peace with neighbors, to live without deceit. It was not perfection, but alignment, like a reed standing straight in the breeze, like a boat drifting with the river's current. In homes of mud brick, families told their children stories of Ma'at, of how she stood beside Ra, the sun god, as he traveled through the sky each day. Without her, darkness would swallow the world. With her, the stars would shine, the fields would ripen, and the people would rest in harmony. And yet, the Egyptians knew how fragile balance could be. Droughts came, floods failed, Invasions shook the borders, and rulers faltered. Whenever disorder spread, they believed Ma'at herself had been wounded. To restore her was not just a duty for kings, but a prayer whispered by every farmer sowing seed, every worker lifting stone, every priest lighting incense. One lesser-known decree tells of punishments for moving boundary stones, a seemingly small crime. But for the Egyptians, this was a tearing of the earth's balance, a theft not just from a neighbor, but from the order of the land itself. Even the shape of a field was touched by Ma'at, and to disturb it was to invite chaos. So the rhythm continued, through centuries of dynasties and change. Ma'at remained the thread binding their lives, woven through every law, every judgment, every prayer. She was not a list, but a breath, not a statute, but a song, not a punishment, but a path. And as the river shimmered beneath the night sky, its surface caught the starlight in fragments. Each reflection was delicate, a balance of dark and bright, a mirror of Ma'at's eternal presence. And there, on the quiet waters, the laws of the universe seemed to rest, glistening softly, waiting in silence.
The hall was wide and still. Its pillars rose like pale reeds carved in stone, catching the dim light that filtered through narrow doorways. The floor carried the soft sound of sandals, the faint scrape of reed pens, the occasional murmur of voices. And at the center, seated with measured breath, was the vizier, the quiet keeper of fairness. In the long span of Egyptian history, the vizier stood as the second figure of the state, below only the pharaoh. Where the pharaoh embodied divine kingship, the vizier embodied justice on earth. He was the bridge between ruler and people, between decree and action, between law and the living. Petitions came to him like the steady flow of the Nile, questions of land, of inheritance, of grain, of truth itself. The vizier did not rush. He listened, he weighed, he decided. One vizier, Rekhmire of the 18th dynasty, left words carved into the walls of his tomb at Thebes. They were not boastful, not songs of battle or riches, but instructions, solemn duties describing how a vizier should act. He wrote, "Regard the man who is known to you like him who is unknown. Regard him who is near like him who is far. Wrongdoing is an abomination to the God, but justice is his beloved." These were not suggestions. They were a code, a compass pointing always toward Ma'at. The vizier's day was heavy with hearing. Farmers brought complaints of stolen donkeys. Scribes spoke of missing grain. Traders accused neighbors of false weights. Inheritance was a frequent quarrel. Sons and daughters disputing fields, wives and brothers contending over houses of mud brick and reed. The vizier sat and listened, each word measured against fairness. Scribes sat cross-legged at his side, reed pens scratching quietly against papyrus. Every word spoken in the hall was inked in careful strokes, every judgment preserved for memory, as though the very gods might one day read these records. And still, the vizier listened more than he spoke. His silence was a tool, pressing truth from the hesitant, drawing honesty from the bold, allowing the weight of Ma'at to fill the space between voices. The halls themselves carried this atmosphere of balance. Carved stone scenes showed order restored, figures of men and women standing straight, arms lifted in gestures of offering, pharaohs seated in majesty with Ma'at beside them. The vizier sat beneath these images, reminded with every glance upward that his role was not his own power, but service. Service to Pharaoh, to people, to Ma'at herself. In some cases, punishments were swift. A thief caught with stolen grain, a corrupt official exposed in bribery, a worker caught falsifying accounts. The vizier had the power to assign lashes, to strip offices, to return stolen goods. But just as often, his work was in resolution. Two neighbors arguing over water rights might leave with a line drawn, a boundary restored, an oath sworn before gods. It was not always about punishment. It was about balance, about smoothing the ripples of dispute so that peace, like still water, could return. Reckmeyer's tomb texts described more. They told of how the vizier was to oversee taxation, to ensure that temples received their offerings, that the granaries held enough for lean years. They told of hearing the poor and weak without bias, of refusing gifts that might sway judgment, of resisting the corruption that hovered always at the edge of power. For the vizier was not merely a judge, he was the eye of Pharaoh, the keeper of truth in daily life. One lesser-known detail in his duties was the attention given to boundaries, stones that marked fields, lines scratched upon the earth. To move a boundary stone was a crime against Ma'at, and the vizier's task was to ensure the land remained as it should. Fields were not just property, they were threads in the fabric of order. To disturb them was to disturb the whole. In the quiet of the courtroom, there were moments when the vizier did not speak at all. Petitioners would kneel, heads lowered, waiting for a response, and silence would stretch like desert horizon. That silence carried weight, not neglect, not indifference, but contemplation. The vizier's pause was part of the judgment, an invisible scale balancing words, a stillness in which truth could rise or fall. When at last he spoke, it was often with few words. A boundary restored, a grain measure returned, a thief's guilt confirmed, an inheritance divided. The words traveled outward like oars dipping into water, steady, calm, moving disputes from turbulence into rhythm. The role was not without danger. To stand so close to Pharaoh meant bearing both trust and scrutiny. A vizier who failed could be stripped of power, or worse. Yet many endured, serving faithfully across reigns, their names preserved in tomb inscriptions, their duties remembered as threads of stability and dynasties that often shifted. Their silence was not emptiness. It was filled with the hum of justice, with the whisper of Ma'at, with the awareness that every case, no matter how small, was part of a greater order. A donkey returned to its owner, a granary thief punished, a child's inheritance protected. Each was a stone placed back into the wall of balance. When the day's hearings ended, the hall grew quiet once more. Scribes rolled their papyrus, petitioners returned to their villages, guards closed the heavy wooden doors, and the vizier sat alone in the vast chamber, limestone walls pale in the fading light, carvings of Pharaoh and Ma'at watching from the shadows. The silence deepened. The air was still. The empty hall carried only the faint echo of footsteps long gone. And there, in that lingering quiet, the voice of the vizier seemed to dissolve, leaving only the weight of stone and the silence of justice, unbroken, waiting, heavy in the air. The Nile flowed endlessly, slow and certain, its waters black beneath the moon, its surface carrying the hush of countless lives lived along its banks. Yet even here, in the land of Ma'at, where balance was sacred, crimes stirred quietly, like ripples upon still water. By day, the river nourished fields of barley and wheat. Farmers bent low with sickles, gathering grain as ibis called in the distance. But by night, some slipped between the granaries, their steps muffled in sand, their hands reaching for sacks not their own. Thefts were among the oldest crimes of Egypt, and the courts recorded them patiently, one case after another, like beads strung upon a cord. Papyrus records speak of stolen donkeys, of missing baskets, of jars of beer taken under cover of darkness. Even tools, plows, axes, fishing nets were stolen. For in a land where survival depended on labor, to lose such things was to lose livelihood itself. Those caught were brought before the vizier's court, their guilt measured not only in goods, but in the disruption they caused to Ma'at. Corruption too seeped through the cracks of daily life. Officials were known to demand more than their due, tax collectors accused of seizing grain far beyond the measure. False weights clinked against true ones, iron or stone made just a little heavier, so that a trader might cheat his customer unseen. The scribes wrote these cases in ink as dark as the river's depths, quietly recording dishonesty in a world that longed for balance. Even the tombs of the mighty were not safe. Perhaps the most chilling crimes were those committed against the dead. In the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs were laid in painted chambers, robbers tunneled by torchlight into sacred walls. They chipped at stone, pried open coffins, stripped gold and jewels from the sleeping forms of kings. The Abbot Papyrus, preserved from the 20th dynasty, speaks in stark detail of such trials. Teams of inspectors entered tombs, listing in careful lines of hieroglyphs what they found. Walls broken, coffins shattered, mummies desecrated. The language was simple, but the weight was heavy. For to rob a tomb was not only to steal treasure, it was to wound the dead, to strip them of their eternity, to offend the gods themselves. False testimony too haunted the courts. Witnesses sometimes spoke lies, seeking advantage, protecting friends, or condemning rivals. But the Egyptians believed that false words carried great danger. Not only might a man suffer unjustly, but the liar's own heart grew heavier, its truth stained for the weighing in the afterlife. Records tell of oaths sworn before gods, hands raised, voices steady, as if to bind the tongue to honesty. To swear falsely was to risk the devourer's jaws, even if no mortal hand punished you. Other crimes touched more intimate corners of life. Adultery was whispered in the streets, brought before judges with trembling voices. A wife accused of straying, a husband of breaking vows, neighbors called as witnesses. The punishments varied, sometimes divorces, sometimes harsher penalties, but always the crime was seen not only as betrayal, but as disorder, a crack in the harmony of family and home. And still, through every crime, there was a rhythm of recording, of judgment, of resolution. The Egyptians were careful keepers of memory. The scribes inked each case, the viziers weighed them, the pharaoh upheld them, as if the very act of righting wrongs could restore balance, placing chaos back into silence. It is striking, too, how even the smallest thefts were preserved in history. A missing loaf of bread, a jar of beer, a stolen goat. These were not forgotten. They were written down with the same gravity as greater matters. For Ma'at was not measured only in crowns and kingdoms, but in the fairness of scales at the market, in the honesty of neighbors, in the quiet respect between one villager and another. The lamps that lit the courts were small, their flames flickering in stone chambers. Imagine the glow of oil lamps, the scent of burning wicks, the low murmur of accusers and defenders. The vizier silent, scribes bending to their papyri, guards standing like statues by the door. Here justice unfolded slowly, as steady as the river's flow, each case a drop falling into the pool of Ma'at. And yet, crimes did not vanish. Granaries were robbed again, tombs broken again, weights falsified again. Order was always fragile, always in need of renewal. The people knew this, and so they told their children, "Do not cheat, do not lie, do not steal, for the scales will remember, and the gods will see." At night, when the courts were empty, the river carried these whispers away. The Nile listened without judgment, its waters reflecting the moon.
Crimes that shook families, that disturbed fields and granaries, were softened in its endless current, washed into silence. And as the ripples spread across the moonlit surface, the balance of Ma'at seemed once again fragile, glistening, waiting to be kept.
The courtroom was a chamber of stone and stillness. Its walls carried no shouts, no sudden movements, only the low rhythm of voices and the faint echo of sandals against limestone floors. It was a place where truth was weighed, where silence was as deep as a well. At the heart of the chamber sat the vizier. He was not a king, yet his presence carried power. Second only to Pharaoh, his task was to steady the balance of Ma'at in daily life. He listened, hands folded, his eyes calm, unreadable. Before him stood the accusers and the accused, ordinary farmers, merchants, workers, scribes, all who found themselves tangled in dispute. The Egyptians called him the father of the fatherless, the husband of the widow. He was to protect the weak, to shield the poor, to hear every voice with equal weight. And so the courtroom opened not with noise, but with careful ceremony. The scribes were the first to prepare. Seated with legs folded, they unrolled papyrus, moistened reed pens in black and red ink. The soft scratching of nib against fiber was like the rustle of reeds along the riverbank. Every word spoken here would be recorded, for justice lived not only in memory, but in writing, etched into scrolls that might outlast the case itself. An accuser stepped forward. His voice trembled as he bowed, hands raised to the vizier in a gesture of respect. He spoke of stolen grain, of fields encroached upon, of dishonest measures at the market. His words fell slowly, each one measured, as if he too weighed them against the feather of Ma'at. When his voice faltered, a witness was called. The witness came forward, lifting a hand to the sky, swearing truth before the gods. Oaths were sacred, spoken aloud as promises not only to men, but to Ra, to Osiris, to Ma'at herself. To break an oath was to endanger the soul, for false testimony was a burden carried into eternity. The vizier spoke little. He listened. That was his power. Like the steady oars of a boat upon the Nile, his silence carried the case forward. Only when needed, he asked questions, his voice low, even, a current guiding all toward truth. The accused then answered, sometimes with fear, sometimes with defiance, sometimes with quiet resignation. Each tone was etched by the scribes, their pens flowing steadily, black for the main words, red for names, for emphasis, for divine titles. To hear those pens scratching was to know that words once spoken would not be lost. Judgment was not rushed. Cases unfolded like the slow opening of a lotus in sunlight. Testimonies overlapped, contradictions tangled, but always the vizier returned to Ma'at, to balance, to fairness, to harmony. Justice was not a personal whim, but a restoration of order, a reweaving of the cosmic fabric. When the judgment came, it was spoken plainly. Sometimes fines were imposed, grain repaid, donkeys returned, debts forgiven. Sometimes lashes were given, punishment carried out to remind the community of truth's weight. And in grave cases, banishment, mutilation, or even death were decreed, though such severity was rare, for Egyptians believed mercy too was a thread of Ma'at. Imagine the room then, the murmur softening, the vizier's words echoing before sinking into silence. The accused bowed, the accuser bowed, and the case was closed. Yet on the papyrus, the ink was still fresh, the record eternal. Archaeologists have found fragments of such records, tucked away in tombs, buried in desert sands. They tell of disputes over boundaries, inheritance quarrels among brothers, accusations of bribery, theft from temples, false witnesses trembling before gods. These were not the affairs of kings and empires, but of everyday life, the quiet frictions of neighbors, the delicate balance of villages. To the Egyptians, the courtroom was more than a hall. It was an extension of the universe itself. As the Nile had its cycles, as the stars kept their patterns, so too must human voices keep harmony. Without justice, the river would flood too high, the crops would fail, the heavens themselves would tilt. Each case, no matter how small, was a ritual of restoration. And always in the background was the steady sound of papyrus. Scrolls unfurled, pens dipped, ink spreading like ripples across still water. The scribes did not speak much, but their presence was constant, their hands ensuring that truth was never lost to silence. Even the rustle of papyrus carried its own solemnity, a reminder that words were alive, that justice was memory made permanent. When the day's cases ended, the courtroom emptied. The vizier rose, the scribes gathered their scrolls, the guards stepped softly into the twilight. The chamber returned to stillness. Only faint marks upon limestone pillars and the scent of extinguished lamps remained behind. And if one lingered there after all had gone, only a sound could be heard, soft, brittle, the rustle of papyrus in the cool air, a whisper of ink and fiber carrying justice into silence, waiting for the next voice to be heard.
The courtroom gave way to something heavier. Once judgments were spoken, they became actions, etched not only upon papyrus, but upon the body, upon the earth, upon the silence of stone. Egyptian justice was not quick anger, nor was it blind fury. It was deliberate, ritual, a measured act meant to restore order to the weave of Ma'at. Punishments were symbols, living reminders that truth was fragile, that chaos forever waited to seep back into the world. The most common punishment was the lash. Whips made from strips of leather, or sometimes reeds, fell across the backs of the guilty. The strokes were counted, measured like beads upon a string, 20, 50, 100 or more. The pain lingered, but so too did the mark, raised ridges across skin, patterns as fleeting as the wind's trace upon the desert sand. Even minor offenses, a false word, a quarrel gone too far, a dishonest scale in the market, could end in lashes. The whip spoke clearly, and its echo carried across the village, a warning to all. For graver crimes, punishment took from the body itself. Hands were removed for thieves, for it was with hands that they had broken order. Ears or noses were cut from those who betrayed trust, so that all who looked upon them saw the visible scar of chaos. A body marked in this way was not only a deterrent, it was a living lesson, an inscription in flesh that spoke where words no longer could. Tomb robbers faced some of the harshest penalties. To violate the resting place of the dead was not merely theft, it was a wound upon eternity. Papyrus records, such as the Abbott Papyrus, describe trials of men who crept into sepulchres by torchlight, breaking seals, scattering sacred amulets, stripping gold from mummies. Their punishment was severe: hands cut off, noses removed, sometimes impalement, a final statement that chaos had no place in the kingdom of the dead. Exile, too, was used. To be driven from Egypt, cast into foreign sands, was a punishment worse than death to some. For it meant separation from Nile, from family, from tomb and temple. It meant a soul might wander untethered, forever denied the ordered fields of the afterlife. Exile severed one from the rhythm of Egypt itself, a silence louder than any whip. There was forced labor. Criminals were sent to quarries, to mines deep in desert cliffs, to haul blocks of stone or break copper from the earth. There, beneath the sun, their punishment became part of Egypt's monuments. Every strike of a hammer, every stone cut for a temple or tomb, was a reminder of crime made useful, of chaos turned to labor. Execution was rare. Life was valued, even in judgment. Yet for treason,
For sacrilege, for betrayal so deep that no balance could restore it, death was decreed. Sometimes it was death by burning, a flame meant to deny even the body's preservation, to erase memory and flesh together. Other times, impalement or drowning carried out the sentence. But such moments were spoken of rarely and carried out solemnly, as though the gods themselves watched close. Egyptian punishment was not meant only to hurt. It was meant to be seen. It was a language of warning, a script written on bodies, on stones, on whispered memory. To scar a man's face was to write his crime upon him, a message that others could read without words. To exile a criminal was to carve absence into a village, an empty space where once a voice had been. In this way, punishment was more than discipline. It was performance, a ritual drama between order and chaos, truth and falsehood. In the temples, the gods were carved holding the symbols of judgment. Ma'at with her feather, Thoth with his reed and palette, Osiris upon his throne, all reminding that justice did not end with mortal courts. The punishment of the body echoed the punishment of the soul. Just as the guilty heart was devoured in the afterlife, so too could a hand or ear be taken in life. Both realms mirrored one another, woven together by the same law. Yet within all this severity, there was mercy. Records tell of pardons, of pharaohs intervening to grant clemency, of punishments reduced, of forgiveness granted. Even here balance was sought, for too much cruelty was as dangerous as too much leniency. Egypt's justice was a weighing of measures, a constant attempt to keep the scale steady. Walk among the ruins today, and the memory lingers. On temple walls, inscriptions describe the duties of the visor: to do ma'at, to give bread to the hungry, to clothe the naked, to protect the orphan, to defend the widow. Yet in those same halls, one imagines echoes of lashes, the faint cries of those struck, the silent weeping of those exiled. Punishment lived not only in records, but in the very stones. Blocks quarried by forced labor still stand in temples. Marks of chisels remain, silent testimony to hands that worked in penance. And the scars carved into bodies, though long vanished, are remembered in the words left behind. Some crimes were indeed written into flesh. Whips traced patterns like wind upon dunes. Hands, ears, and noses bore the sentences of courts. And though bodies have turned to dust, the stone remembers. It remembers in silence, in pillars that still rise, in walls that hold the echo of pain. And if you listen closely in the hush of evening, you might almost hear it, a faint ripple in the air, like a scar pressed deep into time, waiting, unspoken, enduring.
Not all punishments drew blood. Not all carried the sting of whips or the scar of a knife. Some were quieter, softer, yet heavier than any lash. They lived in absence, in silence, in the slow erosion of a name. To the Egyptians, to be remembered was to live. The afterlife itself was nourished by memory. Every carved name, every spoken prayer, every offering placed upon a tomb, these were the food of eternity. So when punishment came not to the flesh, but to the memory, it was exile of the deepest kind. There was the punishment of exile, when a man or woman was cast out, sent away from Nile's familiar rhythm, to be torn from fields of barley, from shaded courtyards, from the water's cool edge, was to be stripped of belonging. Exile meant losing family ties, the right to pray at one's ancestors' tombs, the comfort of knowing that offerings would be left when life was gone. It was a silence of footsteps, a hollow where presence once was. Exiled men labored in foreign sands, their voices unfamiliar to those around them, their names unspoken. In a land where eternity depended on memory, to live nameless in exile was to taste death while still breathing. There was shame, a punishment carried not by guards but by neighbors. Social standing was fragile. A single accusation of theft, of corruption, of false testimony could stain a man's name as surely as the chisel upon stone. Shame clung invisibly. It meant whispers in markets, eyes averted in temples, an empty seat at feasts. No whip was needed. Silence was sharper. Isolation could be deeper than any cut. And then there was erasure, the most final of silences. When rulers fell from favor, when memories became dangerous, their names were cut away. The chisel rang out, patiently striking, flaking dust from sacred walls. The carved cartouche, once circled in eternity, was scraped bare, its center emptied into absence. This was more than punishment. It was the unraveling of existence. The story of Hatshepsut lingers in this silence. She had ruled as pharaoh, daring to place herself among kings, to wear the beard and crown, to be depicted as sovereign of both lands. Yet after her death, chisels sought her out. Her images were hammered away, her cartouches gouged into dust. On temple walls, her story dissolved into empty space. It was as though her presence had never been, as though her reign were a whisper lost in wind. Yet her monument stood, and in their stones her absence spoke. The eraser itself became memory, a reminder that silence can carry its own echo. Akhenaten too faced erasure. He had turned Egypt toward Aten, the blazing disk of the sun, breaking from centuries of worship. He built a new city, filled with hymns to light. But after his death, his name became poison. Walls once bright with his devotion were carved back into anonymity. The chisels bit deep, removing his cartouche, grinding his image into fragments. His city of Amarna fell into ruin, its stones carried away. He was erased not only from temples, but from history's memory, until broken statues, shards of inscriptions, rose again from desert sand to tell what silence had hidden. To the Egyptians, to erase a name was to starve a soul. The dead depended on offerings made by the living. If the name was gone, no prayer could reach them. No bread or beer could nourish them. To erase was to condemn, to exile even from eternity. Thus the chisel became sharper than the whip. Its strokes fell not upon skin, but upon stone and memory, cutting deeper than flesh. The body might endure pain and heal, but a vanished name was a wound that never closed. Even common people feared this silence. A man might live with the dread that if his children forgot him, if his tomb was neglected, his soul would fade. This was why tomb inscriptions pleaded, "O you who pass by, say my name, pour water for me, leave bread for my ka." Memory itself was life. Its absence was the greatest punishment. Shame, exile, erasure, each was a kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but of being unmade. Where lashes left scars, silence left nothing. And perhaps nothing was more terrible. Still, silence carried weight of its own. In time, erased names returned. Hatshepsut remembered, Akhenaten uncovered. Exiles were spoken of again, their absence forming part of the tale. Shame dissolved into dust, but the silence around it remained like a shadow. In this way, even silence became history. Even erasure left a trace. Not all punishments bled upon the skin. Some were quieter, like breath upon sand, like dust upon stone. Some lived in silence, in chipped walls, in forgotten names. They whispered in absence, in shadows where faces once looked out. And in the still halls of temples, beneath fading carvings, you may glimpse it. a cartouche rubbed smooth, its edges faint, its center lost, a name dissolving into dust, falling grain by grain into silence eternal.
Some feared not chains, not the lash, nor the chisel upon stone. Some feared eternity itself. For beyond death lay a court more vast than any hall, and punishments more endless than any exile. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife was not given freely. It was earned, measured, weighed upon scales in the hall of two truths. There, the heart was set against the feather of Ma'at. If heavy with sin, with lies, with the weight of cruelty, it did not rise. It sank, and the soul trembled before its fate. The worst fear was Amit, the devourer of the dead. Part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, she crouched by the scales. If a heart was heavy, she opened her jaws wide. The heart was swallowed whole, its memory extinguished, its chance at eternity gone. This was the second death, the true end, a silence deeper than the tomb. Yet Amit was not the only terror. The Egyptians imagined other punishments, etched into papyrus, painted upon tomb walls, sung in the liturgies of priests. They spoke of burning, of decapitation, of dismemberment beyond the veil, not upon earth, but in the afterlife itself. In the Book of the Dead, spells were written to shield the soul from knives and flames. One text whispered, "I am not one who is bound. I am not one who is burned. I am not one who is slain." Each line was a plea, a defense against punishments that waited in the shadowed realms. The damned were pictured with heads severed, their mouths sealed so they could no longer speak. Others were shown cast into pits of fire, their bodies scorched so that the Ka, the vital essence, could find no rest. Still others wandered thirsty, their tongues cracked, forever longing for water that never came. The Amanduat in the Book of Gates, texts carved in royal tombs, guided pharaohs through 12 hours of night. In their painted passages, the punishments of the unworthy were drawn with care. Souls were tied upside down, their heads severed before the guardians of the underworld. Some were drowned in dark waters, their breath stolen. Others were fed to serpents, their bodies coiled and crushed. There were lakes of fire, blazing in silence, where the unjust were cast, burning without end. And yet, these visions were not cruel inventions. They were warnings, painted softly upon walls, meant to guide the living toward truth, toward balance, toward the light of Ma'at. For the Egyptians, the fear of afterlife punishment was not despair, but discipline. It shaped daily life. To cheat in markets, to give false testimony, to steal from tombs, all these were seeds of weight that burdened the heart. Each small act was measured against eternity. Thus, the farmer sowed fairly, the merchant weighed honestly, the judge listened with care. Each one remembered that their heart would one day rest upon scales, and scales did not lie. The priests spoke often of this balance. At funerals, they recited the negative confession, 42 declarations before the gods. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not polluted the water. I have not slain unjustly. Each phrase was a thread of light, woven into the fabric of eternity. But should a soul falter, should its heart prove heavy, the punishments awaited, dark and vast. There was hunger eternal. A soul might wander through fields of reeds, but find no bread. It might pass by flowing waters, but taste no drink. The torment was not pain, but longing without end, a thirst never quenched, a hunger never stilled. There was darkness unbroken, to be cut off from the sun,
To never see the dawn bark of Ra was exile from all warmth. The sun god's journey through night and morning was the rhythm of existence. To be denied his light was to be cast outside of time, a prisoner of shadow. There was endless wandering. A soul might find itself in desert wastes, sand stretching beyond all horizons. No shrine, no home, no resting place. Only the whisper of wind and the endless dunes. This too was punishment, not fire, not whips, but the solitude of a path that never ended. The Egyptians filled their tombs with charms against such fates. Amulets of scarabs were placed upon hearts to speak words of defense in the hall of judgment. Spells were painted in blue and black on walls and coffins so the soul would be shielded from the knives of demons. Food and drink were left in jars to guard against hunger. Shabti figurines, small and countless, were laid in rows, ready to serve the soul so it would not be forced into endless labor in the beyond. Still, fear remained. No spell could erase entirely the weight of conscience. The heart, Egyptians believed, was not silent. It remembered all things, every word spoken, every deed done. It might rise light or sink heavy. It was witness, it was record, it was judge. So they lived in hope, but also in trembling. Some feared not chains, not prisons of stone, but prisons of eternity. For to be lost in hunger, to thirst without water, to wander without horizon, this was the punishment beyond life. The tombs remain. On their walls are painted scenes of peace, souls walking in the field of reeds, sowing barley, resting in shade, sailing forever upon calm waters. But alongside these linger warnings, images of those whose hearts were untrue, burned, bound, beheaded, erased in shadow. The Egyptians saw both sides, both peace and terror. The choice lay within the heart, always the heart. And so the silence deepens, the scales rest still, the feather of Ma'at trembles. A soul waits, its breath unsteady. If light, it drifts into fields eternal. If heavy, it falls into punishments unending. And somewhere in the dream of desert sands, a lonely figure walks, its steps endless, its path without horizon, its silence stretching forever.
Even the guilty could seek forgiveness. Even the stained could hope for cleansing. The Egyptians believed that mercy was not absent, that ritual could restore balance, that prayers could lift a burden from the heart's quiet weight. They knew Ma'at as truth, as order, as balance against chaos. But Ma'at was not cruel. She was the rhythm of the Nile, the rising and the falling, the season of flood and the season of rest. And just as the river could cleanse its banks, so too could the soul be washed and renewed. Purification began with water. Priests stood at the edges of temples, pouring cool streams from sacred vessels. The drops fell like rain, spilling over foreheads, over hands, over lips. It was called lustration, the washing away of guilt. Every prayer, every sacrifice began with this cleansing. For one must be pure before speaking to the gods. Incense followed. Its smoke rose in curling strands, thin as whispers, fragile as breath. The Egyptians believed that incense pleased the gods, that it carried words upward, through temple roofs, through sky, into eternity. "May my sins be scattered," a petitioner might whisper, like smoke that vanishes in the air. Amulets were crafted to protect and absolve. The scarab, carved in green stone, was placed upon the chest of the dead. Upon its underside, a spell was engraved.
O heart, do not rise against me." It was a plea for silence, a request that memory itself might be merciful. Other charms bore the eye of Horus, its curves traced with blue enamel. It was not only a symbol of sight, but of healing, restoration, the piecing back together of what was broken. The guilty might wear such an amulet and hope that Horus, who once healed from wounding, would heal their spirit as well. Forgiveness was also sought in words. The Book of the Dead held spells not only of defense, but of redemption. Verses promised that sins could be confessed and lifted, that order could be restored. One text pleaded, "Erase my transgressions, cleanse me of impurity. Let me walk in Ma'at, let me join the blessed." Each line was a step toward balance once more. Temples echoed with hymns of mercy. At dawn, priests chanted before statues, their voices slow, their tones low, woven with the rhythm of sistrums. The air trembled with bronze and reed, with prayers of forgiveness, with petitions that the gods might temper justice with compassion. The gods themselves were seen as merciful. Thoth, scribe of the divine court, was not only recorder of truth, but intercessor for those who faltered. He was invoked in spells to write with kindness, to weigh with patience. "May Thoth stand by my side," the supplicant whispered, "when my heart is weighed." Isis too was called upon. She who wept for Osiris, she who guarded her child Horus, was believed to listen to the cries of mortals. Her hymns speak of healing, of rescue, of restoration. To her the guilty brought offerings of milk, of bread, of fragrant oils, hoping her compassion would soften the judgment to come. Even pharaohs granted pardons. As living representatives of Ma'at, they held power not only to condemn, but to forgive. In petitions carved upon limestone stelae, subjects begged for clemency. Some were answered. A farmer, guilty of false testimony, was spared through royal mercy. A worker accused of theft was pardoned after confession, allowed to return to his labor. The gesture was more than kindness. It was the weaving back of order, a thread stitched again into the fabric of balance. Mercy did not erase justice. The Egyptians never believed that guilt could vanish unacknowledged, but they believed it could be transformed. Through confession, through offerings, through ritual, chaos might be softened, reborn into harmony. The guilty were not cast aside forever. They were given paths, slow, winding paths, toward restoration. At funerals, this hope reached its height. Priests lifted their arms, chanting over the coffin, "May he be purified. May she be washed clean. May the heart be lightened. May the path be opened." Incense curled upward, water was poured, spells were spoken. The soul was guided, not as condemned, but as forgiven. For in the Egyptian mind, the afterlife was not closed. It was a field of reeds, a sky of endless journeys. And mercy, like the Nile in flood, could sweep even the heaviest heart into renewal. They feared punishment, yes, but they trusted in redemption. Balance could be restored, even after faltering. A broken life could still be mended. And so temples filled with fragrance. Scribes wrote prayers in careful lines. Pharaohs raised their hands in pardon, and the guilty whispered their confessions into air that smelled of lotus and myrrh. The night deepens. The chants fade. Only the smoke remains, curling upward in silence, slow, fragile, vanishing into unseen air. It lingers for a breath, then disappears, a final whisper of mercy.
Ma'at was the feather. She was the balance. She was the sky itself. She lingered in temples, in courts, in fields, in tombs.
Every breath of order was hers. Every silence of justice was hers. The Egyptians said that to live well was to live in Ma'at. To lie, to steal, to turn aside from truth was to tilt the scales, to disturb the rhythm, to call forth chaos. Yet to act in fairness was to walk with the gods, to rise like dawn, to rest like dusk, to be folded into the eternal balance. In the hall of two truths, a heart once lay beside a feather. The image endured in stone and scroll, a symbol of judgment, a symbol of calm. It was not only for the dead, but for the living, a reminder written into walls and voices. Each Egyptian, farmer or scribe, priest or pharaoh, knew the weight of that image. They carried it quietly, like a shadow at their side. Ma'at was not only judgment. She was law, woven not in long codes, but in custom, in fairness, in the soft rules of daily life. The Nile itself obeyed her, its floods rising with patient rhythm, its waters falling with equal grace. Pharaohs swore to uphold her. Viziers sat in silence for her. Scribes inked her balance into papyrus. Every decree was measured against her. Every pardon was carried by her breath. Crimes, too, returned to her. The thief who slipped into a granary, the tomb robber who lit a lamp underground, the judge who bent his word, the lover who betrayed a vow. Each act was a shadow cast against the feather. Punishments were carved in stone, hands taken, noses cut, names erased. But even there, Ma'at lingered. For punishment was not only pain, it was restoration, a binding back of torn threads, an answer to the wound of chaos. And mercy was hers as well, the incense curling upward, the water poured in blessing, the scarab laid upon the chest, the hymn rising with dawn. These were gifts of Ma'at. She was not only stern, but forgiving, restoring, softening. Even the guilty, through confession and ritual, were drawn back toward her balance. In the tombs of nobles, Ma'at was carved in quiet lines. She sat with her feather, her gaze calm, her presence steady. In the songs of laborers, she was heard in rhythm of oars, in the weight of the harvest, in the fairness of scales. In the courts, her silence lingered between accusation and reply. In the afterlife, her feather drifted, forever waiting. The Egyptians did not imagine life separate from her. She was the thread through all things. To live was to honor Ma'at. To die was to meet her again. To speak truth was to mirror her. To deceive was to stumble from her path. Their inscriptions tell us this. Their papyri whisper it. Their temples hold it still. On the lips of the vizier, in the chants of the priest, in the prayers of the widow, Ma'at returned, again and again. Think of the Nile at night, the water dark, the sky darker still, yet stars rest upon the surface, a reflection as light as air. That was Ma'at. She was the starlight balance drawn down upon the earth. And as the river flowed, her order flowed with it, unbroken, unending. The story is long, but the principle is simple. Every judgment, every punishment, every pardon, every ritual, every silence, every scar, every mercy was drawn into her. Ma'at was not a moment. She was eternity. And so the Egyptians lived, measured not by kings alone, but by the feather of Ma'at. They lived in her rhythm, they died in her shadow. Her echo lingers still, across sand and stone, across texts and fragments, across memory itself. The chamber grows quiet. The incense has long faded. The papyrus rests. The scales are still. Only a feather remains, trembling in silence, light as breath, waiting.
Thank you for drifting through these chambers of time. Here, Ma'at still lingers, feather, balance, breath. Carry her calm into your own night, where silence holds you gently, and the stars shine like ancient echoes. Sleep softly now. History will wait until morning.